Hey, welcome back to my channel. This is Joel Duff, and today another episode of Critiquing Creationism. I saw this article on Answers in Genesis, the cheetah classifying conundrum. And after reading a little bit of it, I thought this would be a good exercise for allowing me to talk about a number of different things, some of which I've not really talked about before. Some of it's going to be repeat material because, that's the way it is. We're going to see the same themes come up. Let's put it that way. I've prepared a number of different things. I've looked at, I've got a couple of articles about the genome of cheetahs. I looked at the mitochondrial genome and did some comparisons. We can talk about how the lack of variation in cheetahs, that's the thing that's really famous. Well, other than they're being really, really fast, right? That's what most people remember. The other thing besides them being really fast is one cheetah is just like another cheetah. They're essentially almost all clones of one another. They're so similar to one another. They have been the traditional explanation is they were bottlenecked way in the past. Bottleneck means that the species was reduced to a very small number, and that small number then required that they basically reproduce with one another. And then over a period of time, when the population remained small, most of the genetic variation was driven out of the population, such that one cheetah has almost all of the same alleles, the same variants as any other cheetah. There's very little variation within the species. So if you've seen one cheetah, you've pretty much seen all the cheetahs. There's some really interesting things to talk about in terms of their homozygosity, their lack of genetic variation. And if I have time, and depending on how this goes, because I'm just going to start talking through this article, and then I'm just going to see where that leads us. I pulled up some other data that I might be other papers that I can go to if I feel led at the moment. But so we might talk genetic entropy. We're certainly going to talk about speciation, post-flood speciation in the creationist model. We're going to talk about what a kind is. We're going to talk about what hybridization data means and whether that's a good characteristic to use for identifying kinds of things, the biblical kind. And so a lot of this is going to be, again, about how do young earth creationists define what a group is, a group of things that was created at the beginning and are naturally related to each other by common ancestry. So if you're a young earth creationist and you look out the world and you see two animals and you ask yourself, are they related by common ancestry, right? Do they share a common ancestor in the past, or did God create them separately? Right? There's got to be an answer for that question for any two organisms you pick. And for creationists, it's very easy. A plankton versus a fish, right? You're going to say those have two different origins. But when you get down to, hey, a fox versus a wolf, do they share a common ancestor, or are they separately created? That's where the fun begins, right? That's where the fun begins. That's where the rubber meets the road in terms of like defining what are the boundaries of created kinds and how much diversity can be formed within a kind, and how far can kinds go in terms of how different can two different species within the same kind get, and you still call them a kind. Because one of the mantras of young earth creationism is that no kind can ever turn into another kind. So no matter how different they become, you still have to call them the same kind. But apparently, since the origin of kinds, they have become more and more and more morphologically distinct from one another, to the point where we're having trouble sort of, tying a bow around this whole group of things that we call a kind, because sometimes some of them seem so different, they don't seem to be in the same kind, but they must be in the same kind, right? Yeah. All right. There we go. I'm already starting my what is a kind thing, and we haven't even got to the article yet. Right? This is on Answers in Genesis, the cheetah classifying conundrum. Are cheetahs really part of the feline created kind? Now, interesting subtitle, right? This is the clickbait portion of this to like, oh, what? Obviously, I think any reader of this is going to be like, of course cheetahs are a type of cat, a type of feline. They're in the feline family. Any evolutionary biologist who does anything with classification is going to put cheetahs within the feline, the feline group, right? The feline family, the Felidae. So what's up with asking this question on Answers in Genesis? Are cheetahs really part of the feline created kind? Let's find out what that's about. Now, one of the reasons I chose this particular article is because it has a nice little introduction that gives you, if you are unaware of what young Earth creationists think about kinds of organisms and species, it gives you a nice little primer on it. By the way, the author here is Karina Altman, and she is the zookeeper for Answers in Genesis. She has a bachelor's in marine biology, and she's worked at a number of other zoos. And currently, it says that she is working on a master's degree at Miami University. All right, so what does Karina have to say here? God tells us that he created every animal according to its kind. Unlike the term species, which references generally the most specific level of biological taxonomy, the created kinds discussed in Scripture typically fall at the family level of classification, sometimes order, sometimes genus. Now there is a huge assumption we're starting with right here in the second sentence. The assumption, I mean, it's just laid out as if this is just facts, right? The created kinds discussed in Scripture typically fall the family level of classification. The family level of classification? All right. There's an enormous amount of discussion about exactly what a kind is, and it's definitely not clear from Scriptures because of the use of the term is not, there's no explicit instructions in Scripture about this is what a kind is. There's no definition of it. All right, so if a kind is at the level, classification level of a genera or a family, like the felines, or an order by way would be like carnivora. Carnivora is an order which contains all of the different true carnivore families. Cats, bears, seals, hyenas, dogs, all right, the red panda, muscelids, and several others, right? Those are all in the carnivora. Now, most young Earth creationists don't place all of those groups together and say they're one kind and they all share a common ancestor. God just created like one carnivore and then boom, they became cats and dogs. Because, I mean, you hear Ken Ham all the time saying cats can't become dogs, right? They're separate kinds. So he doesn't believe that's the ordinal level. So if a kind is higher than the species level, then obviously that means that many species must comprise a single biblical kind. Yeah, there must be dozens, if not hundreds of species that are all contained within the same kind. If they're contained in the same kind, then they all were bottlenecked in the past into 2 individuals or 7 individuals on the ark in the young Earth creationist model just 4,350 years ago. And so all the species we see today have to have evolved, right, from those common ancestors at that point. So, for example, gray wolves, coyotes, and domestic dogs may all be classified as different species of canines, but they belong to a single created kind, the canine kind. During creation week, 6,000 years ago, God did not create gray wolves, coyotes, or domesticated dogs. Right? Got that? If you see a gray wolf, God didn't create the gray wolf like there's a gray wolf. Didn't create coyotes, and he didn't create domesticated dogs. So what did he create? He created generic canines that carried vast genetic potential. So you get that? Generic canines? Draw a picture of a generic canine. I guess it has, the average features of all the different canine species you see today. That's what God created and in those generic kinds, he created vast genetic potential. This harkens back to Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson at Answers in Genesis, who has a model called created heterozygosity and natural selection. That God created the original kinds with a giant load of genetic diversity. They were highly diverse in terms of their genome, their copies of their genomes. And then they took all of that immense variation bottled up within those couple individuals. And what did they do? That was filtered down into many species of canines to see today. You can kind of think of it as like, here's this giant gene pool in just a few individuals. And then as they had offspring, they sorted the gene pool into, hey, you've got this collection of genes, and you've got this collection of alleles, and you've got this collection of variants. And each of those collections of alleles make slightly different looking dogs, canines, which you would call different species. And so each species then becomes sort of separated. They've filtered down into separate pools or pools of genetic variation. Now, one issue with that, of course, is that's happening right away as they be fruitful, as they're fruitful and they multiply, right, after creation. And so as they go out across the original single continent, apparently, of before the flood and make populations, they're making species. But then what happens at the flood? All of those different species aren't on the ark because only two of a kind need to be on the ark. And since they're all the same kind, you can only take two individuals, maybe one from one species, one from another species, or maybe two from one species and put them on the ark. They can't contain all that original variation. They just can't because it's been filtered. If it's been filtered into separate piles, you're never going to get back together. I mean, Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall and broke into lots of little pieces. And now you're going to take a couple pieces and take it to the next generation. But you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. All right. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. During Creation Week. Oh, so he created generic canines that created vast genetic potential, which is now filtered down to many species. Other than studying their genetics, like how else besides looking at their genes might we be able to tell what a kind is? She's admitting that, coyotes and wolves have very similar genes and they're very similar genetically. And so they appear to have a common ancestor. All right. The best proof that these animals are related is, in fact, that they can hybridize. So this is a big key for young Earth creationists, that species, if they can hybridize with another species, that demonstrates that they at one time shared a common ancestor because they shared a common gene pool, right? They recognize those genes from those other individuals well enough that they can make an offspring themselves. Otherwise, it's like you took this massive genetic variation and you filtered it into separate little piles. Well, if individuals from these little piles get back together again and reproduce, they can reproduce potentially because they're simply putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, right? They're bringing some of the variations back together. I said you couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together, but what I meant was you can't put the whole thing back together again. You can put little pieces back together again. This is even true in evolutionary biology. You can have a population that separates, eventually becomes distinct enough, you call it two different species. And then later on, those two different populations might come in contact again with each other, and some hybridization begins, and they actually spread some genes from one to another, and they integress with each other, and they actually share their gene pools. And both of those species then become more similar to one another. They're actually going back to becoming one species again. In fact, it can happen. Two species can meld back together essentially to become one species again. Okay, so the evidence that species can hybridize then becomes, like, for some young Earth creationists, this is the most clear evidence that two different species or two different individuals, two things out there, if they can make a hybrid, they must be the same kind, right? There's an assumption here. The assumption is that when God created different kinds, that they are distinct enough that they're incapable of making any kind of hybrid from them, right? That they're incapable of crossing for some reason. What we call in evolutionary biology or genetics, we call prezygotic mating barriers, right? They just won't ever interact with each other, and so they won't ever even try to make an offspring, right? So that they can't hybridize because they don't even allow themselves to try. But then other organisms will try to hybridize, but their sperm and egg are incompatible, and so they don't form a fertile hybrid. You see, there are organisms that do try to hybridize with other species, or even within the creationist model, one kind trying to hybridize with another kind, but not being successful for essentially genetic reasons in that case. All right, so yes, there are wolf dogs, coy dogs, and so forth. They're relatively common occurrences. Yeah, there's cases of them. Well, there's a lot of variation, hybridization with canines. They're all still canines, right? So if you can show that they hybridize, then that shows that they have common ancestry in the past. All right, there's nothing here that's terribly radical in terms of like evolutionary biologists. People believe that that speciation happens over time from common ancestors. Believes that all canines do share a common ancestor. If you go back far enough in time, there was just one kind of thing that had the characteristics that are a set of unique characteristics that they then shared with their descendants, and their descendants took those characteristics, modified them, and adapted them into new environments, becoming different enough that we call them different species. Well, they'd even classify them in different genera, right? There's Canis, which is wolves and coyotes, but there's vulpes. Vulpes are some of the foxes, not all the foxes. And so those are two different genera because they are more different from one another. And then within those genera, they've adapted and changed into different species. I guess the better way of saying that is one species adapted and had changes and created multiple species. And then over time, as those species continued to change, they became so different from one another, we classify them as genera. And within each of those genera, then they continue to sprout off new species. Okay. And so, oh yeah, back to the hybridization thing. In evolutionary models, you expect that one way to form species is to create barriers to reproduction. But that doesn't always mean that the organisms can't hybridize. It just means that they physically never come in contact with one another. Or it may mean behaviorally they're different enough, like coyotes and wolves, they can live in the same areas, but not really have much contact with each other. So it rarely happens that they're going to hybridize. But they still have enough genetic similarity that they can produce a hybrid. And the thing about most hybrids between most of those species, they're not terribly successful because they make an individual that is often not adapted well to living with their one species or the other species, and they're kind of out on their own because they're not adapted for either of the prior species. That can leave them at a huge disadvantage. But potentially, it could actually form a new species. Because it has characteristics the other two don't have. The combination of things that the others don't have. All right, so hybridization's not shocking, not surprising within an evolutionary model. But of course, the longer organisms have been separate from one another, the more genetically distinct become, the harder and harder it is for them to recognize each other as having common ancestors, because their genes are so different now, they'll find that they have lots of conflicts with each other. Those conflicts will create spontaneous abortion. Either they never make it past the sperm can't enter into the egg, or the sperm can enter into the egg and then maybe it begins to divide, but then there are developmental issues, and so it never produces a viable offspring. I've got a lot more to say about that, but which is sort of some of the stuff that I've not talked about before that I want to kind of try out here. They never turn into a new kind of animal, right? Canines, they become different species and they still hybridize, but they can't become something new. Now, the thing is, there's lots of members of the same kind that can't hybridize within the creationist model. It's like, great, if they can hybridize, that's proof that they're the same kind. So you'd say like, well, then they should just be able to show that what's in a kind pretty easily just by showing whether they get mate or not. Sometimes that's hard to do. It's hard to test. And you can't test it for extinct organisms, right? What about the 50 other species of things that from their fossil record look like different kinds of species of dogs or canines? But you can't do hybridization tests on them, right? So how are you going to know whether they're the same kind? So young Earth creationists have that limitation. Everybody has limitations with fossils in terms of how to know whether they're a species or a family or so forth, because you have limited number of characteristics. Kinds will never change into new kinds, and you'll never see one kind produce offspring with another kind. Well, only if you define your kinds right, I guess, for young Earth creationists. Canines will never breed with felines to create a new kind of animal. Well, really, nobody expects that. They're on divergent lines. They've diverged from a common ancestor a long time ago, the original carnivore. And then since that original carnivore, they have become so different from one another, they're incompatible with each other. And so no one's expecting them to like hybridize and make some new thing. Within each group, they are continuing to adapt and they make new adaptations and are deriving new characteristics, and they can become quite different, just like foxes are really different than wolves, right? Even though they're connected by a common ancestor, but they become so different, they're in different genera. Maybe sometime later, they'll be so different from each other, we'll call them different families, and they'll be completely disconnected. They won't have no ability to hybridize with one another. Now we're getting close to what I want to get to about this. Young Earth creationists have a bit of a conundrum here, because in terms of defining kinds by hybridization, great, I see two things that hybridize, I put them in the same kind, but there's lots of other members of kinds that don't hybridize. So then you're going to say, well, this thing is super like that other organism, and even though it doesn't hybridize, because it's like this other one that I've already put in this kind, maybe I should put it in that kind. All right, so gonna get kind of fuzzy there. I'll show you a figure in just a moment, but let's get down to the cats first, because we're going to delve into the cats. Remember, the whole thing's about cheetahs, right? We haven't even got to the cheetah thing yet. All right, so speaking of cats, right, felines. Cats are an excellent example of the kinds concept. While you won't find tigers, today's largest cats, hybridizing with your domestic cats at home. These two drastically different felines are connected through hybridization data. How so? Well, yes, tigers, lions, leopards, jaguars can all interbreed. Leopards and jaguars can interbreed. Cougars can breed with ocelots. Ocelots can breed with domestic cats. In which, if you follow the trail around, this can hybridize with that. That can hybridize with that. That thing can hybridize with that. That thing can hybridize with that. Now, that thing can't necessarily hybridize with the thing you started out with. Now, that actually sounds like what's called a ring species. A ring species is something like, if you imagine a nice example would be like lizards living all the way on the coast of North America from, say, Seattle all the way down to the Baja Peninsula. And the ones from Seattle can hybridize with the ones in Portland, right? Actually, on the mountains near Portland, all right? So in Oregon. And the ones in Oregon can hybridize, that population can hybridize with Northern California. And those individuals from Northern California can hybridize with ones from Southern California. And they can hybridize with ones from, they're all in the same species. And they can hybridize with ones in the Baja California. But if you take the one from Baja California and you like transport it up to the Seattle area in Washington, and you introduce that particular individual to that population, you're like, they're incapable of hybridizing because they're too genetically different. So what you have is a continuum, right? The ones up here can't pass their genes all the way down there. So the ones at the extremes have been changing a lot, but they're not so different from the ones next to them that they can still hybridize. You see, the hybridization thing can kind of break down kind of gradually. And even within a species, with a huge population, on one end of the population and the other extreme end of the population, they might be incompatible with one another. But they are compatible with their neighbors, and their neighbors are compatible with their neighbors, and their neighbors are compatible with their neighbors. And so the genes kind of flow across the population. But if it doesn't flow fast enough, populations at the edges can become essentially what look like different species than populations on the other edge of that same massive population, if you consider the whole species geographical distribution. So this isn't a particularly rare instance where you have these types of things. And then if you just like kind of chop them off and really isolate them, they're naturally just going to become new species in a fairly short period of time. A couple hundred generations or 1,000 generations. That's a short period of time. So what she's making an argument for is that if you can tie this thing that hybridizes with this other thing, which then hybridizes with the other thing, which hybridizes with the other thing, right? Even though they all can't hybridize with each other, they still form a group. Now, she's actually right here, and young Earth creationists are correct here in the fact that that what's happened is you started with a common ancestor. Common ancestor gave rise to new species. Each new species has a subset of the original variation of the original species, plus they're deriving a bunch of new variants, right, through mutations. And over time, At first, because they're just subsets of variations, they can generally hybridize with one another. And as long as they don't hybridize too much, they can become different species. If they hybridize too much, they'll never become new species. They'll just stay the same species because they're mixing their genes up. So after a while, after more time passes, some populations, some species accumulate more and more and more unique mutations, giving them unique characteristics, which make them harder to cross with other populations. They become less and less and less able to hybridize over time. Right? So the species become more and more distinct. They become, in general, this is very general because sometimes one species can become completely isolated from another and be completely unable to hybridize fairly quickly. Like that's how they got separated, because they had a mutation and it just completely separated. Like, I cannot hybridize with you. Whereas other ones might go through populations of species might go on for millions of years, and they don't accumulate the specific types of mutations that would stop them from hybridizing. And later on, they come in contact with each other, and it's like, yeah, we're really different from each other in a lot of ways, but we can still hybridize. And so you see that in the cat family, because some cats can't hybridize with any other cats. And some cats are like, I'll hybridize with most other cats. Right? And that's just the vagaries of how genes came into existence and the combinations of genes sorting out and new mutations, and which cats got different mutations that other ones never got. And so you're going to get different types of levels of ability to hybridize. Okay, so here we go. This is just a figure showing known hybridizations between different felids. Right, so all these colorful lines show that the jungle cat has been hybridized to the Chinese desert cat, to the African wildcat, to the European wildcat, and the domesticated cat. All right, so all these are different, recognized as different species of cats. Right, whereas the cheetah, the one we're going to talk about, if we ever get there, it's already been 29 minutes. So if we get to talking about cheetahs, the cheetah is incapable of hybridizing, at least as far as anyone's been able to tell, all right, with any other cat species. That hence why Karina is going to ask, is the cheetah really a cat? Is it a feline kind? Because we don't have any hybridization data. We can't show that. It appears to be incapable of hybridizing with any other felines. So maybe it should be considered its own kind. Now she's going to conclude it doesn't, because why? Because it's obviously a cat. Really, that's what it boils down to. It's like, it's got all these features that are just like a cat. So it is a cat. So why can't it hybridize with the rest? Because it's had some mutations and has a specific combination of things that makes it incompatible now with all the other cat species. Now, young earth creationists might come along and say, like, you know what? That's actually genetic entropy. There's evidence of genetic entropy. Right? Genetic entropy is this idea that organisms accumulate mutations, and since most mutations are bad, that should be degrading the genome. The genome should be getting worse in terms of their capacity to make organisms well adapted or fit for their environments. Right? So one way that they could become less fit is they could lose their ability to reproduce as well. And in this case, reproduce with other species. They've lost contact with other species because they've had negative mutations. Right? Now, the thing is, the cheetah is not a good example, because the cheetah actually isn't terribly well adapted to its environment because it lacks a lot of variation. Actually, it's very good. It's still alive, right? But it's not exactly the most successful species. And it is endangered. And maybe part of the reason it's endangered is because it has an incredible lack of variation, therefore is completely unable to adapt to any environmental changes that occur around it. But it's a kind of a specialized case. What Karina's going to say is she's saying that there's 10 of 14 different genera that all have been shown to be able to hybridize with at least one other genus of cats. So that ties them together. And you see that on here because there is some evidence of hybrids between domesticated cats and lots of other things that have been tried. Lots of people have tried to hybridize other species with cats to make unusual, unique cats, right? But you'll see that if you come down here, you'll see that the bay cat The Asian golden cat and the marble cat, no evidence that any three of those species can hybridize with each other, and no evidence that any of those species can hybridize with any other cats. The African golden cat, no evidence they can hybridize with any other cats. The snow leopard, right, as opposed to the other types of leopards, lions, jaguars, and tigers, right, they can all hybridize with one another, but the snow leopard, no evidence of hybridization of the snow leopard with any other kind of cat. And then up here, the puma, the jaguars, and the cheetahs, right? They all are fair. Well, actually, the puma can hybridize, but cheetahs can't hybridize in jaguars, right? The flat-headed cat. Right? There's some other ones in here that don't have any known hybridization events, right? So there's actually a bunch of different cats that are incapable or don't appear to be capable of hybridizing with any other members of the cat family. This is what we'd expect. We'd expect that some cats will not have had the particular mutations they needed to have in order to completely exclude the possibility of hybridization. And other cats happen to just hit upon the some mutation that makes them incapable of hybridizing with anyone outside themselves, where in that particular family, they all have that particular variant and it excludes all other species. So there's a tremendous amount of variation in this. And so I think young Earth creationists might be able to point to this and say like, well, this is all right. You had an original cat ancestor down here somewhere, now in the evolutionary model, and looking at paleontological stuff and dating fossils and so forth. The original cat is considered to be at least 10 million years old. And so most of these other genera, right, are 5 or 6 million years old. And so imagine you go back 5-6 million years ago. Let's say you go back 6 million years. If you were to go back 6 million years, right, there might not be any of these kind of cats up here. Maybe there's only like 4 different kinds of cats, 4 different species of cats total. Right? You start with 1, now you have 4, and those 4 you might all put into the same genus, right? Because they're kind of similar to each other. But each one of them over more time eventually gave rise to a bunch of different species. And they were all collectively more distinct than the other groups that resulted from the other species. And so you end up with different genera that each have different species inside of them. And so back here in time, a creationist could argue, here I'm trying to help creationists out here, all right? Young Earth creationists could argue that the reason why some species can't hybridize is not because they're in a different, they're a different kind. They are the same kind. It's just that if you were to go back in time and you looked at, say, Noah's here. Noah has 2 cats on the ark. They get off the ark and they create a population of cats. I don't know what that cat looked like, right? That would be highly speculative. And then those cats then begin to go into different places, different environments, and adapt or selected in those different environments. So you get some different looking cats in different environments. And so maybe sometime after the flood, and for young Earth creationists, this is how fast it has to happen. Maybe 100 years after the flood. Right, 100 years after the flood, there's 4 basic types of cats that you would walk around. You go like, that's a different kind of cat than that other one I saw when I was up there in the mountains, right? And so maybe you would call those different species at the time, right? And they probably all could hybridize with each other. If I brought some cats down there from this village up in the mountains to this desert area where there's a sand cat, I call them a sand cat, I could introduce them to each other and they could make a hybrid, no problem. But then over time, over many more generations, those ones in the mountains, the ones in the desert, they've accumulated more mutations. We'll call that the genetic entropy effect, right? They accumulate more negative mutations, and they each accumulate different mutations, and therefore, over time, they become less compatible with one another. So now, 500 years later, I bring that cat down and I introduce it to my, I'm like, hey, you want to meet my cat? Oh, that's a really different looking cat. Let's try to make cats between them and make some new hybrids, right? We can sell them for hundreds of denarii, right? So, and they try to do it and it's like, wait a second, well, we're never successful. They're not compatible with each other anymore. They used to be compatible with each other, but they are no longer compatible with each other. You get the drift. Now they just continue to pass those genes on, and then they split into new populations and they become new species. Well, for young Earth creationists, this has to happen like in like super speed, right? Because you have to generate all these different kinds of cats. And don't forget, there's more species of cats that are extinct than are alive today, right? And all those different extinct species, like saber-toothed cats, right? It's been a bunch of other different species of cats, very distinct groups of cats that we don't have today. All of them, we don't have hybridization data for them, obviously. So, creationists are stuck there. But they're still going to be like, oh, they're so morphologically similar. Their bones and everything are similar. Obviously, they were some kind of cat. They still have to have them have a common ancestor right down here. They have to have that. The common ancestor has to be right down here, which is Noah's Ark. And then somewhere in here, right, just very shortly afterwards, they have to split into lots of different kinds of cats because they're going to have to squeeze in another 50 other species of cats that all go extinct. And they have to have lived long enough and had enough individuals that have lived on Earth that they got fossilized, because we have fossils of all those cats, right? Some of them had to go all the way to California and fall in those tar pits, right? And there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of the exact same species in there. Like morphologically, they're so similar, they got to be the same species. Hundreds of them. So it's a large population. And that all happened before the Ice Age. But the Ice Age is only a couple hundred years after the flood, right? So cats got off the ark. They started to reproduce like cats, and they spread across the world. And they generated 50 different species, and each species, they must have had hundreds of thousands of cats, because what are the chances any one of them gets preserved? The young Earth creationists will tell you, like, unless there was a giant flood like Noah's Ark, that's how you could preserve so many fossils. But after that, you can't expect, like, any cat, your house cat, what is the chance it's going to become a fossil someday? Is it going to get stuck in a pit and get covered up with soil, and someday we're going to dig it up and it's going to be a fossil? That's not very likely, right? A 1 in a billion chance, which means you have to have a billion cats in order to have one of them get preserved. All right, so my point is that in order for us to even know that there were 50 other species of cats that we've identified, some of which we've identified from thousands of samples, there had to be huge numbers of populations of these things in the world in order to preserve a very small percentage of them for us to see. So this is a whole lot of speciation in a very, very short period of time, because, by the way, almost every species I'm showing here that is alive today, we have evidence that it was alive probably before the Ice Age, the last Ice Age. No evolutionary biologist is thinking that these species have suddenly appeared in the last 10,000 years after the Ice Age, right? Their fossils are in sediments that are laid down before the Ice Age. And yet for young Earth creationists, every single cat comes from a time after the flood. Now, those folks at Institute for Creation Research out there I was going to say California, because I remember when they were in California, in Texas, all right, in Dallas, Texas. Those folks there, they have a different view of where the flood ends, but I still have not heard any of them acknowledge the idea that there was multiple different cat species, kinds, multiple different multiple different genera of cats before the flood that all were preserved by the flood. They can't say that because there were only 2 cats on the ark. God says bring 2 of every kind. They're limited by their literalistic hermeneutic and definitions of what that means. And so 2 of every kind, that's 2 cats. So those 2 cats got off the ark, and yet here we have evidence in the fossil record of all these different kinds of cats that are very similar to today's. Some of these are clearly related to today's cats. So they had to have come from the common ancestor that came on the ark. This is quite the conundrum. Quite the conundrum for creationists. Yeah. She mentions that there are 4 exceptions: clouded leopards, marbled cats, Asian golden cats, and bay cats, and cheetahs, right, which don't have any hybridization data at all. And then, of course, there's the cheetahs. Evidence says hybridization data is not the only factor for determining genetic relationship. Not only do cheetahs' genetics reveal that they fall well within the feline kind, so this is just a straight up genetic example. If we just look at the genome or sequences of cheetahs, and we look at sequences of DNA from various genes from other kinds of cats, the cheetahs just like fall right inside of the cats. And therefore, can't say that God created cheetahs separately, because then they would be too similar to these other cats. However, two common myths lead people to question whether they're really cats, right? And so some people suggest they're not cats. We don't need to talk about that, all right? Retractable claws and stuff like that. Let's go right down to something she shows here about what's interesting about cheetahs. And she's trying to explain why cheetahs can't reproduce with any other cat, and how one of their differences is interesting. And she shows this figure. And this figure is actually based on a figure from another paper in the literature. And so it's a recreation. I'm not sure I will or not, but I have the original paper. Maybe we'll take a look at that. And what they're saying here is, here's a domesticated cat, actually a feral cat, sorry. First one's a feral cat. Second one is an purebred Abyssinian. So now purebred would mean, right, you're breeding the same cats with the same cats with the same cats with the same cats in order to keep the breed pure. And in this case, the feral cat, this light green color, is heterozygous locations. Now, what it really means is that over a stretch of 1,000 base pairs, if there's more than, I don't know, let's say 20 differences or 25 differences between the two chromosomes, means like mom cat, this cat's mom gave it one allele, this cat's dad gave it a different version of that gene. So that's a heterozygous site, right? Most locations on a genome are homozygous. You and I are 99.9 something percent are the same, which means if you lined up your genomes, 99% of our places where mom and dad gave us something, they gave us exactly the same thing. So we're mostly homozygous. That's not really what we care about, because obviously we have to be really similar in most places because we're the same species. What we're interested in is how much variation there is. And so if you take like I can't remember the exact stat here, but you take like 1,000 base pair segments and you ask yourself, is there more than a certain number of variants within that segment in an individual, like this particular feral cat? And yellow, or greenish, I guess, represents all the little segments of 1,000 base pairs, or maybe it was 10,000 base pairs, which exceed the amount of certain amount of variation. And so they just colored it that. And the blue areas are like, you didn't have enough variation in that 1,000 base pairs. So it doesn't mean there's no variation there. It just means there's a very low amount of variation there. In other words, it's almost all homozygous. So it's the difference between high heterozygosity and lower heterozygosity. And so a feral cat, you end up with, they got a lot of diversity. There's a lot of regions, a lot of portions of their chromosomes that exceed a certain number of genetic variants. And they only have little patches of their genome where they're highly homozygous and have very few variations. Now, feral cats they'll reproduce with any other kind of cat, right? Any other domesticated cat that's not domesticated anymore. But lots of different breeds, right? They're constantly mixing things up. So they're sort of taking all domesticated cats and kind of like jumbling them up. So they have a lot of variation. And then you can see the difference between a feral cat, right? A highly diverse cat. In dogs, we call them a mutt, right? Versus the purebred dog. In this case, the purebred cat, the Abyssinian. What was that? Abyssinian. And we see large chunks, blue chunks in there. All right, and that's indicative of cats that are being mated with close relatives over and over and over and over again. And so eventually mom and dad are giving them the same thing. And therefore they're getting big chunks of DNA where they have almost no variation. And they have a few areas where there's still variation. Now, presumably if you just kept doing this over and over and over again, especially if you shrunk the Abyssinian cat population down to a very small number, one of the concerns about, I have an Old English sheepdog, and there's not really a lot of Old English sheepdogs left. It's considered an endangered breed just simply because there just aren't enough people that take on Old English sheepdogs. And there's only a few breeders, right? And therefore, that particular breed is having, as long as they keep breeding old English sheepdogs with old English sheepdogs, they're getting less and less variation over time. So what's going to happen is it's going to go from this greenish color to more and more and more and more blue. So now you can see the drama here, okay? Because then you come over to the cheetah and you're like, let's check out a cheetah genome. And it's like, it's almost pure blue, meaning like everything falls below the threshold. There's so few variants in the cheetah genome. So you look at one cheetah versus another cheetah, even from a different family, right? You think like, I'll go and get I'll get two cheetahs from two very different places in Africa. And you get them and they're like, bam, they're like the same. It's like there's hardly any differences between these two. Hardly any variation at all. So that is why the cheetah, and that's one thing that's just famous about the cheetah, is like when it was people first started looking at cheetahs and cheetah variation are like, well, there's like no variation here. How do we explain that? And the simplest explanation is that at one point in the past, there might have been large numbers of cheetahs, but they got shrunk down to just a few family members, right? A few dozens possibly, all right? We're not talking about two, right? No one's suggesting they got down to just like there's two cheetahs left and then they had offspring, but just several families that might have been closely related. And then they're having to mate with each other, and therefore they're getting all homozygous sates at this point. And then once you get to this point, what can you do? It's like, where are you going to get new variation from? Right? That's a question for you. Where do you get new variation if you have no variation? There's only one source, right? That's mutations. And mutations are happening, just like they happen for all of us. Like every new human baby that's born typically has 75 to 100 new mutations that are different from what their parents had, right? Their parents had mutations in sperm and egg, gave them to their offspring, and they now have unique variants that their parents didn't have. And that's true for cheetahs. Every cheetah gets a set of a few changes that occur to them. But that's not very many compared to its entire genome, and that's why it's still mostly homozygous. They are building variation. And the more the population grows, the more variants will be added to the population over time. But most of those populations, you have to build up a large amount of variation in order to give yourself enough variation to actually affect much change in terms of evolutionary change over time. What else did I read here? Oh, she actually explains the fact that there's a bottleneck. All right, for example, 60% of cheetahs now suffer from, she mentions that actually cheetahs do have a number of congenital problems. And part of that's, when you go through a bottleneck and there's a negative allele and it becomes really common, natural selection would like to get rid of some of those alleles, but if it's the one that by accident is the one that all the individuals left have, then you pretty much have to keep it, right? You can't get rid of something that everybody has. And so there's going to be some genetic diseases that cause problems in populations that get extremely narrowly bottlenecked. But I remind you, right, that in the young Earth creationist model, every land vertebrate, right, that was represented on the ark was narrowed down to just a few individuals who then had offspring. And what did those offspring have to do? Those offspring had to mate with each other. Well, they could have mated back with their parents, or they had to mate with each other. Either way, they're going to lose a huge amount of genetic variation. Genetic variation is just going to be lost. Whatever they're gaining through mutations is more than exceeded by the tremendous amounts of loss of variation through that very strong inbreeding. Especially since they're going to divide into separate populations. And then they're going to carry variants with them. And then each one of those populations is going to be very small, right? In their model, you have 10 offspring and then 4 of them better go off somewhere else and start a new population because they got to become a new species really quick. And they can't once again hybridize with that original species, their other family members. Because if they do, then they'll never become other species, right? They'll just mix their genes. So they have to go off real quick, but they're a really small population, in which case they just keep losing variation, right? So the problem is going to get compounded over time this way. What caused the bottleneck effect? looking at biblical history, we know that God brought Noah a pair of cats representing the feline kind to board on the ark and survive the global flood. After the ark landed on the mountains of Ararat in Asia Minor and the animals disembarked, God commanded them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Fossil evidence reveals the descendants of cats on Noah's Ark traveled throughout the world. Temporary land bridges during the Ice Age followed the flood, allowed cats to cross into the Americas. Little problem there. Remember what I mentioned before? There's dozens of cat species that are in North America and have been fossilized that are in pre-Ice Age sediments. That suggests they had been there before the Ice Age, right? I mean, wouldn't you have to be there before the Ice Age in order to get preserved in sediments that are going to be covered by ice in the Ice Age? Yeah. So this is, I don't think this is accurate. One lineage became the now extinct America cheetahs, which are very physically similar to the cheetahs we see today. Yes, there was a form of a species of something like a cheetah in North America, but it turns out today we now don't believe it was the same as the Asian cheetah, which originally went to Asia, and then, well, I guess from Noah's Ark, it would go to Asia and then turn into a cheetah, and then those Asian cheetahs went into India and then back into back into Africa. That's what the paleontological evidence suggests, right? The oldest fossils of cheetahs are in Asia. Then we see them very recently in Africa. And I think that's when the bottleneck occurred, by the way, is that when they got basically forced outcompeted or whatever happened to them, their numbers went down, right? And eventually went extinct. And a few members managed to make it into Africa and then expanded out in Africa after that. So there was this period in which they were in very low numbers. Cheetahs are unique among the cat kind. Their morphology and genetics currently provide strong evidence that they are the feline created kind. I just realized it. My old English sheepdog, which I was just talking about, is making a lot of noise. I don't know if you can hear that, but she's chewing on a bone next to me. She just brought in here. Okay, maybe I'll point this down there. London? London! Say hi. Lundy. All right, she just wants to chew her bone. Anyway, there she is. And she's just like every other old English sheepdog. I mean, really, she's like, if you read the directions for like what you're going to get when you get an old English sheepdog, like here's all the features you'll get. Yeah, she ticks them all off. It's like, it's really incredible. Okay. Well, since she's chewing on that, I'm not sure how much farther I'm going to be able to make it here. I haven't gone to the paper to show you some of the genetics. Now, you know what? I think I'm just going to stop here. I'm just going to remind myself, I was going to talk about a little bit more about, there's some other things to talk about with hybridization. And then it's interesting to think about the modeling of the cheetah and how the cheetah kind of represents what an ark species, right, really would have looked like. And so looking at the fate of cheetahs and what's happened to cheetahs, they have not speciated since they became a cheetah into other things that are like variations of cheetahs. There's no variations of cheetahs. They're all the same. And that's kind of what I would expect from animals that got off the ark. So let's just stop there, and I'll get my dog together here and scoot her on out, and I'll think of something else to say at another time. All right. Thanks for hanging with me on this beginning discussion about cheetahs and young earth creationism as we critique creationism. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.